She didn't suddenly become distant or attentive or confusing. What changed is that she started thinking about you more than she planned to. And when that happens, her behavior doesn't become obvious. It becomes layered. There's a moment most men miss, a quiet shift. It doesn't come with a confession or a clear signal. Instead, it shows up in small contradictions. She replies late but reads your message instantly. She seems busy, yet finds subtle ways to stay connected. She pulls back, then unexpectedly leans in. This is where most men misunderstand. You see inconsistency, but what's actually happening beneath the surface is internal conflict. Because when a woman starts thinking about you constantly, it doesn't feel simple to her. It's not just attraction, it's not just curiosity. It's a psychological loop she didn't fully choose but now can't easily ignore. At first, it begins quietly. You cross her mind at random moments while she's doing something unrelated. While she's with friends, even when she's trying to focus on something else, and she doesn't immediately recognize it as something significant. She brushes it off, but then it happens again and again until it stops feeling random and starts feeling persistent. Now, here is where things shift. Instead of moving closer in a clear, direct way, she becomes more careful, more aware, almost as if she's observing you from a distance while being emotionally pulled towards you at the same time. You're focusing on what she does instead of why she does it. Her slight hesitation, her mixed signals, her unexpected behavior, it's not confusion about you. It's her trying to manage what she's starting to feel. Because thinking about someone constantly creates emotional exposure, and emotional exposure for most people doesn't feel safe. So she doesn't rush forward, she adjusts. She watches, she tests the emotional space between you. There's a subtle tension that begins to form, one that you can feel but can't quite explain. Conversations might feel deeper but also slightly guarded. Her tone might soften, but her availability becomes unpredictable. And this is where the illusion begins. You might think she's losing interest, or that she's unsure about you, or that she's simply inconsistent by nature. But that's not what's happening. What's actually happening beneath the surface is that you've become mentally present in her world more than she expected. And that changes everything. Because once a woman starts thinking about you constantly, her behavior stops being about simple attraction and starts becoming about emotional control. She's not just reacting to you anymore. She's reacting to what you're becoming in her mind. And that version of you, the one she keeps replaying, analyzing, and trying to understand, begins to influence how she shows up around you in ways that don't always make immediate sense. This is why she might seem different without any clear reason. Not distant, not closer, just different. And if you don't understand this shift, you'll misread everything that comes next. Because what looks like inconsistency is actually a sign of something much deeper beginning to form. What's actually happening beneath the surface is not just attraction, it's cognitive occupation. You're no longer just someone she interacts with. You've become someone her mind returns to without permission. And that changes the way she processes everything about you. Because when a woman starts thinking about you constantly, her brain doesn't just replay moments, it starts building meaning around them. A simple conversation becomes something she revisits later. Analyzing tone, choice of words, pauses, she remembers details you've probably forgotten. Not because she's trying to, but because her mind has quietly assigned you importance. This is where things deepen. Most men assume attraction is expressed through obvious behaviors. More messages, more attention, more presence. But you're focusing on what she does instead of why she does it. When her thoughts start looping around you, she becomes more internally engaged, not externally obvious. She starts asking silent questions. Why does he make me feel this way? Why am I thinking about him right now? What does this actually mean? And here's the part that most people don't realize. The more she thinks about you, the less impulsive she becomes with you. Because now it matters. When something starts to matter emotionally, the brain naturally slows things down. It becomes more cautious, more observant, more controlled. So instead of expressing everything freely, she begins to filter herself. This is why her behavior might seem measured. She might take longer to reply, not because she doesn't care, but because she does. She rereads messages before sending them. She thinks about how she comes across. She becomes aware of how much she's revealing. What's actually happening beneath the surface is emotional self-regulation. She's trying to stay balanced while something inside her is slowly becoming unbalanced. And that creates a very specific kind of tension, one where she feels pulled towards you mentally, but doesn't want to lose control emotionally. So she creates space, not distance in the traditional sense, but psychological space. She might not always initiate, but she notices when you don't. She might not always open up, but she listens more closely when you do. She might act unaffected, but internally your presence lingers longer than it should. This is where most men misread the situation. They see reduced effort and assume reduced interest. But what's actually happening is deeper than that. When a woman is constantly thinking about you, she's not trying to increase interaction. She's trying to understand the impact you're having on her. Because emotional patterns don't just form, they demand explanation. And until she understands what you mean to her, she won't fully express how she feels about you. So instead of moving forward clearly, she stays in this in between state, observing, feeling, analyzing. And the more this continues, the more her internal world starts to revolve around you in subtle, quiet ways. Ways you won't always see directly, but you'll feel them. In the pauses, in the timing, in the way she's present, even when she's not fully showing it. This isn't inconsistency, this is her mind trying to keep up with emotions that are growing faster than she expected. And if you don't understand this, you'll mistake her control for disinterest, when in reality, it's the exact opposite. As this continues, her behavior starts forming patterns. Not obvious ones, but consistent enough that if you pay attention, you begin to notice something beneath the surface. Because when a woman is thinking about you constantly, it doesn't just stay in her mind, it leaks into how she shows up around you. Not loudly, not directly, but in ways that feel intentional without being explained. This is where hidden patterns begin to reveal themselves. You might notice that she appears at the same moments repeatedly, not in a predictable, scheduled way, but almost as if she instinctively aligns her presence with yours. She checks your messages around the same times. She becomes active when you are. She enters conversation in a way that feels coincidental but happens too often to be random. This is where most men misunderstand. You think it's coincidence, but what's actually happening beneath the surface is subconscious prioritization. Her mind has started placing you higher in her internal hierarchy. And because of that, her attention naturally orients toward you even when she's not consciously trying to. And then there's the way she remembers things. Details you mentioned once casually come back later. Not in a forced way, but woven into conversation as if they quietly stayed with her. She recalls small preferences, small opinions, even small changes in your tone. You're focusing on what she does instead of why she does it. She's not just remembering information, she's holding on to pieces of you. Because when someone occupies your thoughts constantly, Your brain starts collecting fragments, trying to build a clearer picture of who they are and what they mean to you. Another pattern shows up in her emotional responses. They become slightly amplified but controlled. If you pull back a little, she feels it more than she shows. If you give attention, she registers it deeply, even if her reaction seems calm. Her emotional sensitivity towards you increases, but her expression of it becomes more refined. And that contrast is where the signal exists. Because what's actually happening beneath the surface is emotional investment growing, while emotional exposure is being managed. So instead of reacting openly, she adjusts subtly. She might tease you more, but with a softness that wasn't there before. She might challenge you, but without pushing you away. She might withdraw briefly, only to return in a way that feels more intentional than before. This push and pull isn't a game, it's calibration. She's trying to find a position where she can stay connected to you without feeling like she's losing control of herself. And then there's one of the most overlooked patterns: silence. Not absence, but intentional quiet. Moments where she doesn't reach out, not because she's disconnected, but because she's processing. She steps back internally to understand why you're affecting her the way you are. This is where most men make a mistake. They see silence and assume disinterest. But what's actually happening is deeper than that. When a woman is constantly thinking about you, silence often becomes a space where those thoughts intensify, not disappear. She replays interactions, she imagines possibilities, she questions her own reactions, and the more she does this, the more real you become in her internal world. Not just as a person she talks to, but as someone who's starting to matter. These patterns don't shout, they whisper, and if you're only looking for obvious signs, you'll miss them completely. But once you understand them, you start to see the consistency behind what once felt confusing, because none of this is random. It's her mind slowly organizing itself around you, while she's still trying to understand why. This is the point where most men get it completely wrong. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they're interpreting her behavior through the wrong lens. They see her hesitation and assume uncertainty. They see her silence and assume distance. They see her control and assume lack of interest. But you're focusing on what she does instead of why she does it. And that misunderstanding quietly shifts your behavior in a way that breaks the dynamic. Because when you misread her internal process, you start reacting externally, you chase clarity, you push for consistency, you try to figure her out by increasing pressure. And without realizing it, you interrupt something that was naturally developing. What's actually happening beneath the surface is that she's trying to maintain emotional balance while her thoughts about you are becoming more frequent, more automatic, more significant. But when she feels that you're demanding certainty too early, it creates resistance. Not because she doesn't feel something, but because now she feels observed. And when a woman feels observed too closely while she's still processing her emotions, she pulls back to protect that internal space. This is where the dynamic shifts in a way most men don't expect. Instead of moving closer, she becomes more controlled, more neutral, more careful with her energy, not because her feelings disappeared, but because the environment around those feelings no longer feels safe to explore. This is the critical mistake. You try to move things forward at the exact moment she needs space to understand what's already happening inside her. And in doing so, you force her out of her natural emotional rhythm. Because attraction that lives in the mind doesn't grow under pressure. It grows in space, in subtlety, in moments where she can think about you without being forced to define you. This is the mindset shift most men never make. You don't need to increase intensity when she's already thinking about you constantly. You don't need to demand attention when her attention is already returning to you on its own. You don't need to force connection when connection is already forming internally. What you need is restraint. Because when a woman is mentally invested, the strongest position you can hold is not pursuit, it's presence. Calm, unreactive, grounded presence. You respond, but you don't chase. You engage, but you don't overwhelm. You remain consistent, but not demanding. And this creates something powerful. It allows her internal world to expand without interference. It gives her space to move from thinking about you to understanding what you mean to her. Because until she reaches that understanding on her own, anything forced externally will feel unstable. This is where control actually exists, not in trying to manage her behavior, but in managing your reaction to it. Because once you stop reacting to surface level signals and start understanding the depth behind them, your behavior naturally becomes more aligned, more calm, more intentional. And that changes how she experiences you. You're no longer just someone she's thinking about. You become someone she feels safe thinking about. And that is where everything begins to shift in your favor. At this stage, everything becomes quieter. Not because the feelings are fading, but because they're settling into something more stable, more real. When a woman has been thinking about you constantly for a while, something important happens internally. The questions begin to slow down, the overanalysis starts to fade. And what replaces it is clarity. Not the loud emotional kind, but a calm understanding of how you make her feel. This is where most men finally notice a change, but misunderstand it again, because her behavior doesn't suddenly become intense or dramatic. It becomes consistent. There's less push, less pull, less hesitation, less overthinking, and more quiet presence. She doesn't need to test the connection as much because she's already processed it internally. She doesn't need to create distance because she no longer feels overwhelmed by what she feels. What's actually happening beneath the surface is emotional alignment. Her thoughts about you, her feelings about you, and her behavior toward you start moving in the same direction. And when that happens, everything becomes simpler. She shows up more naturally. She responds without overthinking every word. She allows moments to flow instead of controlling them. But here's the part that matters most. This phase only happens if nothing disrupted the earlier stages. If she was given space to think. If she didn't feel rushed to define something she was still understanding. If the connection was allowed to develop without pressure. Because when a woman reaches clarity on her own, it feels certain to her. And certainty doesn't need to be loud. It shows up in small, grounded ways. In the way she stays instead of leaving. In the way she engages without hesitation. In the way her energy becomes steady instead of unpredictable. You're focusing on what she does instead of why she does it. She's not acting differently now because something suddenly changed. She's acting differently because she finally understands what she was feeling all along. And that understanding removes the need for confusion. This is where everything becomes clear if you're paying attention. Because the woman who once seemed inconsistent is now consistent. The one who once held back now opens naturally. The one who once created space now maintains connection. Not because you forced it, but because she chose it. And that choice is always stronger than anything you could have tried to control. So if you ever find yourself in that uncertain phase again, where her behavior feels mixed, where her presence feels unpredictable, don't rush to label it. Look deeper because sometimes what feels like distance is actually the beginning of something forming internally. And if you understand that, you stop reacting to confusion and start recognizing patterns. You stop chasing clarity and start allowing it to develop. because when a woman is thinking about you constantly, the process is already in motion. Your role is not to speed it up. Your role is to not disrupt it. And if this made you see things differently, subscribe, because understanding her mind changes everything.